I've got your point me to it again.
Yeah, the third one from the bottom.
Right there.
Yeah.
Okay. That's what we got, huh? Okay.
And just, okay.
Okay.
How do you put it up there?
Yeah, can we get that one up there? Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Monty, for that excellent review of the baseline archaeological data, and thanks also to Keystone for the opportunity to review the cultural resource work undertaken in connection with the proposed Pebble Mine. Just a couple of preparatory comments before looking at what I did here in the PowerPoint. First of all, I do want to mention that the set of data that we're addressing here this morning are a bit different from the set of data that we've talked about in terms of the recreational data that we just looked at, or the socioeconomic data that we looked at yesterday afternoon, in the sense that, as Monty himself pointed out, there had been relatively little in the way of field work in the particularly in the core area of proposed development, and that necessitated Stephen Braun and Associates for doing their own archaeological work in the area, as well as summarizing existing data. So that means we need to address here the nature of the work that they've undertaken themselves, as well as summarizing existing data. And I do want to mention, as a part of that, I've had some experience in doing archaeological work in South Central and Southwestern Alaska. Pretty familiar with the cultural history of the region, and did visit the current drilling locations to get some additional feel for the nature of the archaeological reconnaissance work being conducted out there. But I also want to mention that Monty also has had considerable experience in archaeological reconnaissance in the same areas. So, he's not going to be, and his associates are not going to be missing any sites out there. I think you can be pretty confident that what they've reported is what's really out there. And I do want to mention also, as a part of that, in many ways the methodology being used by Stephen Braun and Associates is really not only very solid, but actually very cutting edge, particularly in the area of marrying together the archaeological fieldwork and assessment of previous archaeological fieldwork with these cultural resource interviews from the local population. I think that's particularly enhanced by the fact that they are a group that really does a combination of both rigorous ethnographic and archaeological research simultaneously, and that makes them, I think, relatively unusual, maybe even unique in Alaska, and really, recommends them in particular for carrying on this kind of work. And I'll be coming back to that, as a theme in what I'm talking about here. But I do also want to mention that my comments are mostly addressed to the EBD itself, because I haven't really had access to. I've seen some of the materials from this later work, but I haven't really had access to the post EBD report. So I'm going to be addressing mostly the EBD report, and that means two chapters: chapter 22 on the Bristol Bay area, and to some degree chapter 50 on the Cook Inlet area. And so there's not, some things not included in what you just saw in that earlier EBD, like some of the snow patches, like the Evanoff 2010 place name study, and so on. But anyway, I just wanted to mention that at the beginning. So in terms of the previous work, or in terms of what's in the EBD, there are 89 documented sites mentioned from the AHRS, the Alaska Historical Resource Survey, kind of the catalog of known sites in Alaska. And as Monty mentioned, only a couple of these are really directly in, for example, the current footprint for the drilling area. And the AHRS data are really limited to the discussions that are really focused on the relatively limited amount of work done in that area by people like Joan Townsend, Van Stone, the Yarbroughs, Catherine Arndt, and others, especially the work of Townsend and Pedro Bay. It's not that there isn't a considerable archaeological interest in this area, which is an important area of the intersection of Athabascan and Yupik cultures, and very complex cultural history, including the origins of a couple of particular ancient traditions of interest to archaeologists, and then later Russian and American penetration into the area. It's just that the remoteness of the region, some of the difficulties of doing field work there, and frankly, maybe a focus on other areas that have produced, much very large, elaborate sites and so on, has limited work in the area, and has really created the necessity for them to undertake their own field work in the area, and also this very important, again, oral history work in the area to obtain those kinds of data. So in my view, good archaeology is informed by a theoretical model, just like the socioeconomic work that we heard about yesterday afternoon, in which data on site numbers, location, size, density, and distribution are obtained and then compared or correlated with various environmental and geomorphological variables to try to understand what those data mean, and to try to assess something about the significance of those sites, particularly, even as a part of baseline work, particularly given the fact that, future impact-related studies might be utilizing these baseline data to determine what, the significance, to the degree to which sites known from the area actually represent significant sites in one way or another. To present the culture history in terms of periods of occupation, artifacts, assemblages, radiocarbon dates, and shifts over time in all of these site characteristics. And then to pull all these things together to really talk about humans on the landscape over time. What does this mean in terms of shifts in animal populations and really, people on the landscape in a more comprehensive way. So one of my issues is I wish that some of the excellent data that they presented could have been discussed in a little bit more general or theoretical terms, or in terms of summary statements about the data. And then in particular, of course, and one comment I do want to make about all of this is much of what I have to say here is not at all the result of anything that's intentional in the research design of Braun and Associates, but is largely related to the kind of directives that they have in terms of the direction of their studies, where they're to be carried out, the nature of those studies, and so on. And of course, much of the comments here in terms of judging significance based on determinations of eligibility has a lot to do with not anything that they're doing, but things that are done at higher levels to assess their data and determine the level of significance, and particularly in terms of what we call eligibility for inclusion on the National Register of Historic Places. Of the 89 previously documented sites, 64 as they had cataloged had no determination of eligibility, and of course have not yet been done or hadn't been done for the baseline discovered sites, at least at the time which that report was done. Other things have to do with the available data in terms of nailing down the time of occupation of people in the past at the area. Originally, there were a few radiocarbon dates presented. They've got a lot more now as a result of further work, both in the field and analysis. There were discussions of possible samples and other samples taken, but at the time of the EBD, those dates hadn't been produced. It would also have been nice as a part of the report to have summarized all of this tabular data that you saw presented here in terms of the time period, the kinds of artifacts and structures, and so on, to make those data, I think, a little bit more comprehensible in a synthetic fashion. And also, again, to link these kinds of things to what's known about changes over time, to the extent it is known, in the resources that might have been available to people, or paleoenvironmental studies that may have been done not necessarily directly in that area, but in the broader region. And also, to go beyond simply the site locations obtained as a result of the oral history data, to get a more perhaps impressionistic data about people's values about the landscape, the kind of things, some of the kinds of things that we were talking about yesterday. They do. This is one of my favorite quotes, actually getting at this sort of thing, which they talk about a web of a relationship connecting and subdividing communities surrounding Iliamna Lake with shared histories of conflict, cooperation, and lives lived out on the land. Just more of that would have been great. In terms of the actual methodology, what was done is to undertake what they call the probability survey, which involves a kind of a probabilistic assessment of the likelihood that sites would be found in certain environments. Really what most archaeologists would call judgmental sampling. And actually, I totally agree with this methodology. I think that in this kind of environment, a cost-benefit analysis would suggest that you're going to recover a lot more data if you really prioritize the areas where you think, for a variety of reasons, environmental and cultural, well, you're more likely to find sites. But I think it would also have been useful to develop a true predictive model, a quantitative model of the kind that people like Ben Potter at University of Alaska Fairbanks have developed for his cultural resource management work, perhaps, in which you do a statistical assessment of the relationship between site distribution and various environmental features as a part of that kind of work. Well, to get back to this issue of judgmental sampling, they mention specifically that they focused on, quite logically, areas that are for cultural reasons likely to be areas in which one is to find sites, areas in the vicinity of fresh water, river, stream, and lake shores, which, without specifying, more likely for fishing, caribou hunting, predominantly in the past, moose hunting more recently, I think, as the environment's changed over the last 100 years or so. Upland areas with overlooks for spotting game animals such as ridgelines and mountaintops, areas for concentrating game animals like passes and draws, and they excluded wetlands and seasonally wet tundra because people aren't likely to be living and using those kind of environments as a base for hunting. And then they also talked about site preservation conditions, and happily these things are pretty much the same kinds of situations. That is, you're likely to get archaeological sites preserved in areas of soil accumulation, in dry areas along river, stream, and lake shores, and in dry uplands, the slopes of bedrock hills, and on glacial landforms. And it would tend to exclude wetlands as areas in which you're going to get sites preserved. So happily, the kinds of areas in which people utilized in the past and the kind of areas in which sites are preserved are likely to be very much the same kinds of places. And also the visibility of sites, as you've seen from some of Monty's examples, is much likely to be greater in the uplands and the lowlands as well. Problems with these, however, are related to the fact that maybe some of the areas that are wetland environments today weren't necessarily wetlands in the past. It's a shift over time in the change of environments. And if you look at the report, actually, there is some attention paid to this. They mention this fact. and yet did have made attempts to look at areas that in the past may have been areas of occupation, but wouldn't be the kind of areas that today might be, such as relict or former stream channels, kettles, lake beds, and these kinds of areas. So it's much to their credit that they examined these kinds of areas. Again, it's not completely clear from the EBD the degree to which these low probability areas were originally sampled. They talk about both not transecting them in some cases and transecting them in other cases, but it's my understanding that post-EB times there really has been an attempt to look at some of these low probability areas. Doesn't mean they've recovered appreciably more from those areas, but at least they have been looked at to a more considerable extent. One of the other things is there's generally been a kind of a shift, particularly from the EBD period to the post-EBD period, to moving from a more general assessment of the greater area to specifically the areas in the vicinity of the exploratory drilling sites or areas that are directly related to other infrastructural developments related to the mine. And I think in some ways, from the viewpoint of archaeologists anyway, it means that there could be less attention being placed on potential survey areas, not necessarily those having even direct impact, but also indirect impact from development in the region, which we've learned as a result of a number of phenomena such as the Exxon Valdez, that activities can extend beyond the direct area. And so, broader areas need to be included in the baseline as a result. And then, as Monty himself mentioned, although there had been considerable previous archaeological work done in the transportation corridor study area, little additional work has yet been undertaken in that area, including apparently the post-EBD study area. He did mention the area west of the New Halen River between Nundalton and Iliamna, but as he saw in his own slide, perhaps the time of year in which that was undertaken was not optimal in terms of really understanding what was going on even in that one particular area. And I think that it has to be admitted that in terms of what's been done in the coastal Cook Inlet drainage areas, focusing only on the vicinity of possible Pebble Project components, with special attention paid to the area around Knollhead, at least at the time of the EBD study, that it's relatively limited, that if you're interested in potential broader impacts, maybe even including, what could flooding do to the area, or whatever it might be, even in a remote way, some potential impact or consequence, it's useful to have as baseline data, perhaps a broader set of data from that area. In terms of the actual methodology used on the ground, they mentioned closely spaced test excavations, mentioned something about the nature of the testing that was due, but it would have been useful to have had data on the specific testing methods used for specific site areas, specific landforms in different areas. And also, again, while judgmental sampling was preferred to the use of rectangular grids, occasionally the use of those other kinds of alternative methods resulting in systematic, even counterintuitive examination of certain landforms would be useful. But once again, as was mentioned in the EBD, over time they've moved to, I think, better methodologies, and they certainly mentioned the adoption of better field technologies, including better GPS technology and so on, as things have progressed, and undoubtedly that applies to the post-EBD work as well. And then finally, I wanted to conclude with, what I think is one of the really areas to be highlighted in terms of the work that they've done, and that is the importance of this oral history research, this cultural resource research coming from interviews and not relying on the archaeological data alone. This allows a linkage with contemporary people. It presents data on aspects of land use and values not present in the archaeological record, on usage of areas in which you get no archaeological deposits, particularly in an area of relatively poor preservation or visibility. Those are really important data. And in fact, I think it could be argued that in many ways the data coming from people in the area tells us about areas where there might have been sites in the past where there just hasn't been preservation due to various different kinds of conditions or changes in the landscape over time. So I think that's very valuable data. They did in the EBD, outline some of the problems they had in terms of responses to consultation letters where they weren't able to get elder interviews, and this may have been changed in post-EBD research, relative lack of informants in some areas. The main thing was, as they pointed out in their report, that these areas had not been ground truthed, so that while the archaeological data, are done on the ground, the cultural resource information from people in the area hadn't been ground truthed. And they also talked about some of the difficulties in pinpointing these exact locations, given the kind of mapping procedures that they used. But obviously that's something that needs to be done in the future. But overall, the level of this data, the number of sites and features that have come from this research really does represent an excellent body of data. So I want to conclude with some recommendations for future methodology in the region as a result of enhanced environmental baseline work or whatever, or continuing archaeological and cultural resource work in the area that might take place, and that is to undertake survey in previously uncovered areas, particularly the transportation corridor, to expand areas of coverage beyond the immediate environs of drilling sites and infrastructural developments, and in all areas. And then as a part of that, when designing a reconnaissance methodology, to consider expanding the footprint beyond, a short distance from the center line, for example, of the transportation corridor into more distant areas, given what we know of how both direct and indirect impacts might expand beyond those areas. To maintain their current methodology of focusing on higher probability areas, but to consider some lower probability areas as well. To consider the use of predictive modeling, ground truthing of traditional use sites derived from the oral history, to run some additional radiocarbon dates if samples may be available, and then to consider synthesizing the data by time period and so on, so that it's a little bit more, I think, understandable, particularly by the general public looking at this information. So those are my comments. I think I probably went on as long as Monty did in terms of talking about this, but I hope it might be and again, like Steve said, this is meant in a constructive way to be helpful in terms of thinking about what might be done in terms of future baseline data. I've tried to stay away from talking about anything related to any potential impact. That's a fine line there, but I'm trying to focus here primarily on some constructive ideas for future perhaps modification of baseline data information. So.